your interest. A couple of words of introduction to the annual report, and I consider this introduction as a reading help because we cover you with a lot of paper or a lot of information. Let me just contextualize. The annual report is our standard reporting to donors. It's an opportunity to tell you where in the implementation of ICRC objectives we find ourselves and what activities and achievements we are accountable for in 2013. So it's not dealing with the period January to today, although in my introductory remark I will try to make the link between the situation today and where we are coming from. You will see from the structure that it deals with the headquarter activity, the field activity, and it gives a lot of information on finance and administration. Let me also say then when you read to the report, just recognize that ICRC is not just a relief organization, and you see it from this annual report once again. We have three important pillars. We are active in policy, in law and law development, law application and law development, and we have an operational arm, which is our assistance and protection work. We are not only active in dealing with the impact of armed conflict, but also in preventing armed conflict within our mandate of international humanitarian law. And you will see throughout the annual report that some of the basics of ICRC's approach to how we deal with issues, very contextual, multidisciplinary, is reflected almost on each and every page of this report. So we are not an organization dealing with only one segment, but trying to find a more comprehensive response to the assistance and protection need of people in armed conflict. I also wanted to draw your attention to three new features in the annual report, which is that each region is introduced by a dashboard where you see what we have done overall in that region, in the Africas, in the Americas, and this is very practical and handy for you as journalists. Also, we have a sort of a separate report which tracks the most important features, which is smaller than the annual report, more handy. That's the kind of thing you wish to have on your desk, probably, just to reference figures. And in the electronic version, you will find from the major operations of ICRC 3 pagers which allow you to find yourself quickly into what we are doing. So that's more the technical part of the introduction I briefly wanted to make to give you some reading aid when you look things and to draw your attention to what is new. Let me just make a couple of remarks more substantively on our work. First, when I came to ICRC 2 years ago, my sort of first impression in participating in the debates of the governance and the organization was that conflicts were transforming fast, and traditional armed conflict, either international or internal, was disappearing from the landscape, and increasing new forms of violence, what we call other situations of violence, urban violence, criminal violence, drug cartels, were the ones taking the forefront in conflict and violence. Today, and looking at 2013, we have to recognize that armed conflict has given a powerful comeback. And that in its core ICRC, while we still are observing the other forms of violence as well, this is a development which we won't turn back the clock. But if you look at this 2013 annual report, and if you look at the development since the end of December, we have been busy with very traditional internal armed conflict in South Sudan, in Syria, in the Central African Republic, in many other places in which we are active for years already, in the DRC, in Afghanistan. We are looking at regional conflicts. If we look at Syria, we look at the whole region where conflict has broken out in Anbar province in Iraq. So armed conflict, internal armed conflict has made a very powerful comeback. You have also seen that since the publication of the report, we have presented to donor countries in some of those areas important budget additions. This is true for Central African Republic, where we added since end of December 15 million a couple of weeks ago. It's true for Syria, where we have presented to donors a major budget increase just a couple of days ago, which was presented to you by the head of the region, Robert Mardini. We have added an important amount to our operation in South Sudan, which is one of the biggest operation in terms of budget in the meantime. With a plus of 48 million, it comes to 112 million a budget for 2014. And we have added, since the publication of this report, an important budget addition to our activities in the Philippines, which is the mix of natural disaster and conflict on which we are active. So let me just make this clear as, again, an important point, the clear importance of armed conflict. Second point, if you look through the report, I wanted to highlight the will and wish of ICRC to be as complementary as possible with others, or to put it in other terms, to be where others are not. And just to highlight you a couple of areas where you would like to draw your attention in reading the report. If you look at rural Afghanistan, if you look at south of Yemen, if you look at the central and south of Somalia, if you look at the rural DRC, if you look at Iraq Anbar province, if you look at northern Nigeria, if you look at the north of Mali, and if you look at some parts of the Philippines or Colombia, it's ICRC most of the time with very few other actors. Some international NGOs, some local NGOs covering that ground. So our operation is largely complementary to others. It's designed to be covering those areas where others can't, and it's underlining, I think, our capacity still with the specific approach of ICRC to cover ground in terms of assisting and protecting people that other humanitarian actors have had even more difficulties than we. When I say this, let me make a third point, and that's I'm not underestimating, and please do not underestimate, the challenges with which we are confronted in delivering. And I have mentioned this several times, but here again, when you read or look through the report, be aware that we have seen in 2013 quite a dramatic shift in increase of complexities. We have seen many of the conflicts going regional, meaning that the impact is by far not limited to the country in which the conflict is unfolding, but it has regional implications. Syria is the most prominent. You have seen that we responded by making a regional appeal, but the Central African Republic, Mali, Niger, South Sudan, we are looking at a region of instability, which in the future will even more demand that we look in a regional perspective at some of those conflicts. So complexity in terms of impact on neighboring countries have increased. Complexities in terms of origins of violences have have increased. I sometimes mention visits to hospitals, which are most of the time the best illustration what I mean by more complicated and complex origins of violence. In a single hospital, you find, for instance, in Bangui, the sort of injured from the Seleka and Anti-Balakas who have fought with each other. You find the poor guy who has been shot at when he stole a bicycle or a banana in the shop. You have those who have been, you have families who have been victims of attacks from other families because they are of different religions. So you have inter-ethnic, inter-religious, inter-community violence, you have criminal violence, you have internal armed conflict, and the superposition of these problems have become very complex and difficult to manage. And in this report here, you will see how we juggle with some of those complexities of managing those different origins of violence. We have seen important security and access problems. I have spoken many times on those issues, challenges going from Syria to Central African Republic to others with different motives and reasons. We are struggling with increasingly assertive states wanting to control international contributions to humanitarian action, which is a legitimate target of a sovereign government. But at the same time, this legitimate target of sovereign governments comes into conflict with our analysis on where the needs are. And we are in increasingly complicated negotiations with governments who think they should control what internationals are doing, and our ambition to reach people in need. And sometimes this is a happy end in a sense that we do agree on a surface of operation which is comfortable for the government and comfortable for ICRC, and sometimes it's more difficult. As you know, for instance, at the present moment, we continue to be in relatively difficult negotiations with the government of Sudan in order to have again an agreement between ICRC and Sudan for our operational activities. So just wanted to give you a sense, and this was my third point, that we have some important challenges with which we are dealing. My fourth point is that when you read through the report, and I spare you now big figures, but nevertheless as examples, despite all those difficulties, we have been able to deliver on the biggest budget ICRC in its history has presented to donors. You remember, and I have mentioned this beforehand, that at the beginning of 2013, we had a relatively modest budget. At the end of 2013, with the budget allocations and supplements that we have asked, we have ended up with the largest budget, and we do concrete activities. We have visited more than 750,000 prisoners, almost 24,000 individual interviews with prisoners in 101 contexts. We have assisted 7 million IDPs in 55 countries. We have assisted on water 28 million people in 58 countries. We have treated 8 million patients in 326 hospitals and 560 healthcare facilities in different contexts. We have provided assistance to more than 280,000 disabled in 90 countries of the world. And we have delivered 22,000 prostheses to those new prostheses to those people. We have delivered forensic services in 50 countries on missing people. We have exchanged more than 100,000 Red Cross messages, and we have delivered more than 150 specialized courses for 125,000 militaries in more than 90 countries on international humanitarian law in 2013. I mean, these are examples out of this report, taken out of this report, just to illustrate that while we are confronted with important challenges, with more complex environment, we still manage to do quite important work in assisting and protecting people. My fifth point, may I just draw your attention when you look through the report on some of the horizontal, transversal issues on which ICRC has been active and which are recurring patterns of problems and violence in different contexts in which we are active. This is where we report on the Healthcare in Danger initiative, which has progressed significantly in 2013 and which we hope at the Red Cross conference of next year will materialize in concrete recommendations that countries and the movement can agree upon in terms of policy orientation. We have in 2013 considerably increased our activities and conceptualizing on sexual violence, and we have deployed in the meantime pilot programs in a couple of countries, in particular in Africa, on sexual violence. And we have considerably also increased, and here again in the policy part of the reports, you will find accountability on our interaction with different other stakeholders, from the movement to the United Nations, to international NGOs, to academia, to the private sector. So this report also accounts for how and what ICRC is doing with other actors in the field. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is my sixth point, have a special look at ICRC's law and policy activities. I know that in terms of communication, it's always the operational assistance and protection work which is of keen interest to you. But we are committed to lead those two processes with regard to improving mechanisms of application of international humanitarian law, and which we hope to come to a decision moment at the next international conference, as well as detention in non-international armed conflict. You probably know about those processes. And we have continued over the past year, as we continue now, to deal with new weapons and new weapons technology development and international humanitarian law, to find the adequacy on automated weapons, cyber warfare, drones, and all those issues which need framing in terms of international humanitarian law with regard to those new developments. Let me conclude in saying that while ICRC is happy to deliver on the mandate given by states through the Geneva Convention to assist and protect people in armed conflict, we should never forget that the mandate comes from states, and that the final responsibility on delivering is a political responsibility and not a humanitarian. So I know that you are journalists. I had this morning the opportunity to brief the permanent representatives to the United Nations here in Geneva on this report, and I made a little bit more explicit and extensive reminder that humanitarians can solve humanitarian problems. Humanitarians can mitigate on the impact of armed conflict and humanitarian problems, and we have moduses operandi to do so. But at the end of the day, if states are not working politically to solve some of those problems at the origin, we will always be in a tension between our ability to deliver and the needs with which we are confronted. So let me stop here and give you the opportunity to ask questions, unless, Regis, for the moment it's fine? Okay, so floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, Agnès.
Une des très grandes. La première reste la Syrie aujourd'hui, mais avec 112 millions maintenant, c'est la numéro 2. Oui. Sud-Soudan, c'est maintenant la numéro 2. Et la raison pour laquelle elle devient deuxième, c'est aussi parce que, très franchement, c'est le nombre de gens affectés et en même temps, c'est les difficultés logistiques. Hein. Au Sud-Soudan, le grand problème, ce n'est pas tellement que... On a toujours des problèmes d'accès, n'est-ce pas? Mais ce n'est pas qu'il y a une objection de principe, quelque part, ni du gouvernement, ni des forces armées rebelles, de prévenir nos activités. Ils sont en principe d'accord qu'on agit, mais logistiquement, c'est extrêmement difficile avec les multiples déplacements qu'on a vu depuis le 15 décembre. Les gens sont vraiment dans des endroits souvent difficilement accessibles et puis ça augmente considérablement aussi les coûts de cette opération. Et excusez-moi d'un peu d'enchaîner, mais pour vous expliquer pourquoi le Sud-Soudan est devenu la deuxième opération au point de vue budgétaire. Mais vous aviez une deuxième question.
Oui, c'était par rapport à ce qui a été dit la semaine passée par le CICR. Vous attendiez le feu vert pour venir en aide, apporter de l'aide aux gens à Alep. Est-ce que vous avez reçu ce feu vert depuis ?
Non, alors aujourd'hui, en gros, finalement, je crois que si on parle maintenant de la Syrie, donc en gros, je pense qu'effectivement, on est toujours dans une approche où on a certaines contraintes d'accès. Et puis donc, Alep était effectivement une de nos priorités par rapport finalement à l'ampleur de la réponse aussi qu'on aimerait pouvoir mettre en œuvre, parce qu'on a des capacités pour la mettre en œuvre. Et aujourd'hui, à ce stade, finalement, on n'a encore pas reçu les autorisations pour mettre en œuvre cette opération.
Oui, pardon, passez le micro.
Dmitrichev, Russian News Agency TASS. The last year, the Ukraine wasn't on the agenda, and now we have crisis there. And my question is, do you think that the situation in Ukraine will increase the budget of ICRC? And because I know that the last 2 weeks ago, you asked for more medical supplies for south and east part of Ukraine. Could you speak about the situation right now?
Well, the situation in Ukraine is, of course, very high also on our radar screen, and we try to adapt to the problems as they unfold. In our perception, for a long month, over the past couple of months, Ukraine has not been a country with humanitarian problems first and foremost. This has been a country with political problems and tensions. Nevertheless, since last year, we started to cooperate with the Ukrainian Red Cross in order to increase their capacities to deal with humanitarian problems out of the mass demonstrations. So from zero operation in Ukraine, we started to build up a cooperation with the Ukrainian Red Cross around the Maidan place in terms of emergency evacuation, in terms of medical activities. When the situation unfolded in the east of Ukraine and then in Crimea, we increased our operations, still working very closely with the respective Red Cross societies in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. And at the present moment, ICRC has 22 delegates in Ukraine, including the delegates which are in Crimea at the present moment, and we have offices in Simferopol, in Odessa, in the Kharkov,
and Donetsk.
And in Kiev. So we are still observing and trying to see where are activities and problems emerging which are covered by our humanitarian mandate in terms of detention visits, on which we have made service offers to the Ukrainian authority as well as to the local authorities in the east. In terms of humanitarian problems which may emerge because of the disruption of public life because of the unrest in the country. In terms of soldiers which somehow are unaccounted for, or where chains of command are not anymore very clear. So we are trying to engage pragmatically with the respective local and central authorities in terms of trying to find how we can contribute to mitigate some of the humanitarian problems. And so while I hope that this remains a very modest operation, only future can tell us, and the conflict as it unfolds can tell us whether more will be needed. But again, it's an operation which is now at a budget of 4 to 5 million Swiss francs, and unforeseeable for me on what by the end of 2014 the budget will be. But at the present moment, we are running in that category of budget.
But just on the budget question, so of course, yes, we are investing money in Ukraine these days because we started with a budget of close to zero because we had no permanent presence. We are popping up the budget, and we are looking at what we call a budget extension because, of course, already with the amount of money spent today and with the situation as it evolves, we have gone from being very much in support of the Ukrainian Red Cross to being more directly involved, playing also this role. We brought in like medical support, I mean, through the different groups. So in that sense, I think we will play a more direct role in responding to the situation.
Let me also be maybe very transparent on one aspect of our activity, because I know this is a particularly delicate aspect, and it's the relationship between different sections of the Ukrainian Red Cross, including the section in Crimea, which, of course, with the change of sovereignty, is eager to join the Russian Red Cross. I think ICRC's approach on this is that this is, of course, a highly sensitive and political environment, and we are encouraging all sections of the Red Cross in Crimea as well as in eastern Ukraine and in the Ukraine as a whole to focus on concrete activities and not on status and allegiances. So our engagement is with all of them, and in order to try to focus on what do people need and how can the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement as a whole, or in this case in particular ICRC and the respective Red Cross societies, how can we deliver on some of the needs in terms of coping with disruptions of services, access to detention, engagement with armed groups to respect basic provisions of international humanitarian law in use of force. These are the traditional issues with which ICRC is dealing and trying to do capacity building, engage with, and contribute to the crisis in Ukraine.
Yes, Blaise, please.
Bon, tout d'abord, pour vous dire à cette occasion aussi quelle énorme appréciation j'ai pour les efforts que l'Akhtar Brahimi a entrepris pendant tout son mandat sur la Syrie ces derniers mois et ces derniers 2 ans. On était vraiment en contact presque continuel pour voir comment une contribution diplomatique et politique pouvait contribuer à élargir la surface opérationnelle des humanitaires. Je pense l'Akhtar a dit ce qu'il a à dire sur sa déception qu'il n'a pas réussi à mettre les parties ensemble. Ce que je peux dire un peu dans la même direction de ce que l'Akhtar Brahimi a dit hier, c'est que j'ai de forts doutes que nous allons voir en tant qu'humanitaires des espaces considérablement différents s'ouvrir en Syrie si les États principalement affectés par cette crise et qui ont une influence sur les acteurs de cette crise ne travaillent pas dans la même direction et dans le même esprit. Et pour le moment, malheureusement, ce n'est pas le cas. Soyons très clairs, que les États d'influence ont des intérêts différents. Et aussi longtemps que les intérêts sont aussi différents, je crains que l'espace humanitaire avec lequel qu'on pourra essayer de gérer, n'est-ce pas, en Syrie, restera fortement limité tel qu'il l'est aujourd'hui. Et donc, je pense le CICR, les Nations Unies et d'autres vont continuer leur effort à convaincre les États d'abord de leurs responsabilités et aussi de l'intérêt primordial qu'on aimerait voir donné aux intérêts humanitaires. Et vous m'avez entendu à plusieurs reprises dans le passé dire que, et je le répète, si la même énergie avec laquelle on a réussi à faire un accord sur les armes chimiques serait utilisée pour arriver à un consensus humanitaire, de créer un espace dans lequel une action neutre, impartiale et indépendante, surtout impartiale, peut être délivrée, nous aurons peut-être, et surtout le peuple syrien se verra peut-être avec une situation bien meilleure. Aussi longtemps que ça ne se passe pas comme ça, on sera limité. Et à chaque fois que vous me verrez, vous m'entendrez dire que l'espace ou l'écart entre ce qu'on fait et ce qu'on devrait faire devient plus grand. Et cette dynamique que j'ai critiquée depuis longtemps, elle est en marche aujourd'hui, même si nous avons présenté il y a quelques jours un budget record sur la Syrie. Et même si je considère qu'on sera capable d'abord à avoir cet argent et à le dépenser raisonnablement, et même si on vous présente un budget record, ça ne sera pas suffisant pour changer la dynamique dans laquelle on est. Et donc, c'est exactement ce que je viens de dire, n'est-ce pas? C'est-à-dire, il y a une responsabilité politique qu'on ne peut pas imputer aux organisations humanitaires. C'est les États qui doivent se mettre ensemble et qui doivent trouver un chemin pour reconnaître que si les services humanitaires ne sont pas améliorées, il y aura des effets négatifs sur le peuple syrien d'abord, sur l'ensemble de la Syrie, sur les pays voisins, et un effet déstabilisateur qui pourrait encore nous hanter davantage dans l'avenir. Je l'ai illustré par la désintégration des systèmes médicaux, on pourrait l'illustrer par la difficulté avec cette situation qui continue à avoir des systèmes d'eau et de sanitation satisfaisants pour les Syriens et les peuples voisins. On verra des crises plus pointues surgir s'il n'y a pas un retour ou une autre dynamique qui doit être politique.
Madame, derrière. Oui, pardon.
Thank you very much. Gabriela Sotomayor from Mexican News Agency. Regarding the humanitarian situation in Syria and the states that you are talking about, don't you think that they have been very indulgent with the government of Mr. Bashar al-Assad? And I have another question regarding
With regard to, I'm not blaming the ones or the other for the one or the other thing. I'm just saying as long as those who have an influence on developments and actors in Syria do not agree that there are more important things than their differences, and that more important things are, for instance, the worry on the health and survival of Syrians suffering from the impact of armed conflict. And as long as there is no overwhelming agreement that this is a priority and is in the interest of those countries as well as of Syrians, we may not find a different dynamic. And so I'm not saying that the ones are indulgent against with the regime and the others with the opposition or vice versa. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm trying to say that there may be an interest to look at the overarching interest that and responsibilities that we have as international community and as countries, and as a president of a humanitarian organization, it's my task to constantly recall that putting humanitarian interests first place in a context like Syria is not only an issue of law, it's not only an issue of principle, it's not an issue of ethics, it's also an issue of the interests themselves of those countries. Because what we are seeing is a strong destabilization and destruction of a country, of its people, and of a whole region.
Nefael Malici, journaliste albanais de Kosovo. Monsieur le Président, comme vous savez, parce que surtout Belgrade, il y a quelques semaines, il y a quelques jours, ils ont trouvé une fosse commune. On parle pour vers 200, 300 disparus.
Je peux peut-être commencer, et puis Régis, si tu as d'autres choses encore à ajouter, n'est-ce pas? J'ai dit dans mon introduction, je vous ai rendu attentif, n'est-ce pas, que une des activités importantes et souvent oubliées du CICR dans 50 contextes aujourd'hui au monde, et le Kosovo est un des contextes dans lequel on est actif pour soutenir les capacités, les procédures et pour accélérer aussi le processus qui devrait mener à plus de clarté pour les familles et leurs proches du destin des personnes qui sont disparues, qui sont missing. Hein. Donc, vous aurez vu et vous verrez dans le rapport qu'on vous présente aujourd'hui, on reste actif sur les Balkans, on reste actif avec les institutions respectives pour assurer que tout notre savoir et nos compétences sont aussi transférées vers nos collègues des Croix-Rouges nationales et des institutions nationales pour accélérer le processus de clarification sur les missing.
À Bruxelles, est-ce qu'on peut mettre par exemple comme condition pour intégrer, est-ce qu'on peut mettre comme les conditions pour les disparus pour trouver, pour avoir une meilleure intégration, parce que la Serbie et aussi Kosovo l'attendent et être membre de l'Union européenne.
Bon, vous savez, nous, on ne met pas des conditions dans des négociations auxquelles on ne participe pas. Mais ce que je peux dire qu'on espérait et qu'on essaye de convaincre non seulement les partis sur le Balkan, mais aussi dans d'autres contextes au monde, de travailler ensemble pour clarifier le destin des disparus. Et comme vous dites à juste titre, c'est un problème qui pèse sur les sociétés, qui souvent est un obstacle à la réconciliation des sociétés, et c'est la raison pour laquelle nous pensons que c'est un domaine crucial de notre activité humanitaire de mettre autant que nous le pouvons notre engagement du côté de ceux qui veulent accélérer et clarifier le destin de ces personnes.
Peut-être juste quelques points là-dessus. D'abord, merci beaucoup pour la question, parce qu'on a beaucoup parlé du CICR et de la CICR qui est présent dans tous ces endroits où personne ne veut en quelque part aller, mais on a aussi peu parlé par contre de toutes ces victimes oubliées. Et c'est vrai qu'une de nos forces, c'est notre capacité de travailler dans la durée et de faire en sorte qu'on n'oublie jamais ces victimes de conflits, et plusieurs de ces victimes sont effectivement ce qu'on appelle, nous, des missing. Donc, le cas particulier des Balkans, je crois qu'aujourd'hui, on reste, en tant que CICR, des années après le conflit, le moteur pour justement faire en sorte que, d'une manière ou d'une autre, ces familles aient le droit d'avoir des nouvelles sur où sont passés leurs proches. Maintenant, je vais tout de suite rajouter une partie. Nous, on va aussi toujours avoir le même message. Il faut dépolitiser le débat lorsqu'on parle de questions humanitaires. Donc, dans notre cas, on a un objectif et un objectif unique. C'est finalement, effectivement, de pouvoir donner des nouvelles aux familles, et puis, parce qu'elles sont dans le désarroi, et elles restent, et elles deviennent âgées, elles vont disparaître, peut-être sans jamais savoir. Et ça, c'est le message principal. Maintenant, il faut absolument éviter d'en faire, justement, une utilisation politique, parce que ça n'amènera finalement pas à ce qui devrait être le but premier de chacun de ces États, c'est de vouloir effectivement nous aider ou contribuer à ce que ces victimes puissent, en fait, ces familles puissent finalement avoir de ces nouvelles. Mais donc, je crois qu'aujourd'hui, il y a beaucoup de débats à l'interne, beaucoup de gens posent des questions, mais jusqu'à quand est-ce qu'on va continuer en tant que CICR Et on est toujours là, et notre staff, je les ai rencontrés à Istanbul il y a quelques jours, ils ont une motivation énorme pour essayer justement de faire en sorte qu'on ait des nouvelles par rapport aux personnes. Donc dans ce cas-là, je crois qu'on peut compter sur cette persévérance du CICR, comme on peut compter sur la persévérance du CICR qui peut visiter des prisons pendant des années, et qui continuera finalement à venir amener un minimum finalement de réconfort à toutes ces familles qui en ont besoin.
Ce que nous attendons, n'est-ce pas, de tous les partis, c'est aussi qu'ils s'engagent eux-mêmes, n'est-ce pas? On ne peut pas laisser tout simplement ce travail être fait par le CICR. Et où je voyage dans le monde, n'est-ce pas, et on a des activités de ce genre, j'essaye toujours de convaincre gouvernement et parlement que l'allocation de ressources et de capacités pour résoudre ce problème est crucial pour la réconciliation de société. Et malheureusement, en effet, dans beaucoup de contextes, on voit que c'est un des sujets qui est dépriorisé, comme on appelle euphémistiquement ce genre de processus, n'est-ce pas? On considère que ce n'est pas actuel, que ce n'est pas prioritaire, et ça gicle dans les négociations budgétaires de Parlement et de gouvernement parce que, en fin de compte, la constituency, les groupes de pression derrière ce sujet ne sont pas souvent les plus puissants. C'est le rôle du CICR de rendre attentif toujours que vous n'aurez pas réconciliation durable sans avoir résolu ce problème même, et de soutenir ceux qui mettent des énergies et des capacités dans la résolution de ce sujet.
Oui, monsieur.
Hans-Jürgen Maurer aus Südwestrundfunk, ARD-Studio in Zürich. Mr. Maurer, I wonder, you were recently in Iran. What was your most important goal? Did you achieve it? And maybe you could tell us a bit about your personal impressions there. Second question, today was UNHCR presented a report about internally displaced people. We have a record numbers of 33.3 million. I just one quote, if you permit. It's worse than in the darkest hours of the 90s when we had the genocide in Bosnia, and the Balkans, in Rwanda, and the Congo. That's a quote from this morning, the presentation. And you just said a powerful comeback of armed conflict. I agree, unfortunately, but how? What is happening, I wonder? I mean, what is really happening? Thank you.
The $20 million question. I try first with a slightly easier one on my trip to Iran. Several objectives in our conversation with the Iranian Red Crescent and the Iranian government. First, you may know that for 2 years now we have entertained what we call a strategic partnership with the Iranian Red Crescent, who is one of the very powerful national societies in the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement with enormous capacities. And we are developing cooperation with the Iranian Red Crescent in different parts of the world, in which ICRC's capacities and skill for negotiating access and being present, and Iranian Red Crescent capacities to deliver logistics and goods and medicine are very complementary. So one of the aims was to take our cooperation with the Iranian Red Crescent 1 or 2 steps further. You never achieve those goals in one visit, but what I can certainly say is that the Iranian Red Crescent is a very valuable partner, and we are in agreement that we will continue to enlarge our cooperation, which is valid, which has activities within Iran, but also in some of the contexts in some of the humanitarian contexts outside Iran. With regard to my conversations with the Iranian authorities, the main objective was to find a more structured dialogue with the Iranian authorities on some of the issues of concern to ICRC, but also of concern to Iran with regard to some of the humanitarian crises in the world. So Syria, of course, has been an important issue. We have discussed other contexts, Afghanistan, Iraq. You know that coming back to the missing, that this is an important file still in the Iran-Iraq relations today from the respective war of 20 years ago. So still an important operation, a tripartite commission that ICRC is chairing between Iraq and Iran on the missing of the Iran-Iraq war. So there is a panoply of activities to discuss, to take stock of, to kick the ball forward, and to see how we will work together. We have also discussed how within Iraq to work with the within Iran to work with the Iranian authorities in terms of engagement with the armed forces, development of international humanitarian law, engaging on the adequacy and similarities and mutual reinforcing of Islamic law and Islam and international humanitarian law. So it's a broad range of issues that we have discussed, and I'm very satisfied on the results of the conversation in terms that they were concrete and specific and allow us to move 1 or 2 or 3 steps forward in some of those files of cooperation or engagement on those issues. With regard to hypothesizing on what is behind it, I'm not going to speculate on that, but just once again to share with you also the impression which probably Antonio has shared today with you, and we are talking a lot, that we have seen dynamics in several parts of the world which are adding enormous complexities, contagious effects of crises spreading, deepening of crises, as I mentioned beforehand in my introduction, and some of the result is displacements in terms of refugees and IDPs that you have received the very numbers of. I mean, at the end of the day, although this seems a little bit an abstract maybe assertion I can do, is that obviously we are struggling with an international system which has difficulties to come to consensus. And when powers in the international system have difficulties to come to consensus on some of the essentials, then you probably see happening what is happening. Then probably there is not sufficient cohesion in the international system which compels different types of actors to respect certain parameters. And if we see or have the impression, I don't know whether the impression is true or not, there is no sort of objective study on violation of international humanitarian law, but we have a subjective impression that we see more violations, deviations from behavior consistent with international humanitarian law, then it's also a sign that this system has and struggles with bringing important powers together towards some minimal consensus.
more questions? Yes, Gabriela?
Yes, thank you. If you can answer my second question, please, because you are mentioning here that there was 1,400 incidents in 23 countries against volunteers and personnel. So what about accountability in these cases? Did you call for investigation on these cases, or what happened in this particular situation? Thank you.
Well, volunteers who work with the ICRC or with the National Red Cross, most of the time they are employees of the National Red Crescent or Red Cross societies. We certainly consider them part of our activities, and we try to find their whereabouts, the reason of their disappearance, the reasons of what happened to them, and we engage with the respective authorities in order to find out what happened. If we have indication that they are detained by authorities, we try to engage for their liberation. We are not known and are not an organization with a mandate for legal accountability. That doesn't mean that we don't care about legal accountability. We care about legal accountability, but there are other institutions dealing with legal accountability. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I just want to remind that there is more material on our website in addition to the news release that you already got at the beginning. Thank you.
There is much more on our
On a 13, je vais même vous donner le truc. On a 13 staff international et puis 9 personnes qui sont du staff national qui travaillent pour nous. Donc ça fait 22 staff. On avait personne sur place parce que justement finalement on avait une délégation régionale qui couvrait la Russie, l'Ukraine et puis différents pays. Et puis donc on a eu une délégation à l'époque qu'on a fermée parce que finalement il n'y avait pas de raison pour nous d'être présents puisqu'on n'était pas dans une situation de violence ou de conflit. Et donc